Do you know how it feels to really love something, but deep down in your heart, you know that you won't ever be able to share those same feelings with someone else? I'm not just talking about how you can show a movie to a friend or loved one hoping for a certain kind of response, only to get an indication of indifference from them once the credits roll. No, what I'm talking about is something on a somewhat deeper, more existential level. There's an unbreakable barrier that emotionally separates you and the other person in question from ever experiencing the same kind of emotion through a medium of art. That's how it is for my parents and I as far as video games are concerned. I mean, they were born in the early 60s, so that's not surprising in the slightest. The medium of interactive entertainment has vibed much more with people of my generation. But the unfortunate thing is that since people like my parents have and never will get into video games, they won't get to feel the power of some of gaming's best stories in the way that were meant to be experienced. Earlier this year, I made a video about video game adaptations and why they're usually tough to get right. Building off the many points I made in that video, we may possibly get a good representation of what The Last of Us is like when Season 1 of the TV adaptation airs on HBO next year, but there's also a chance that we could get something like the Uncharted movie starring Tom Holland. General movie-going audiences may watch that film and think it's a decent treasure-hunting adventure, but people such as myself who have played the Uncharted games know how much more impactful those stories were in interactive form. The problem isn't so much that the idea of adapting video games inherently translates into bad cinema, it's just that oftentimes the end results of those adaptations do a poor job of representing why people fell in love with the source material in the first place. This is why I was severely disappointed with the first season of the Halo TV series on Paramount Plus. Now, before going any further with the review, Paramount has been vindictive in how they've copyright claimed many reviews of this show on YouTube. As confident as I may be with my ability to edit together a video that fairly uses their content, I don't want to run the risk of Paramount blasting my channel into oblivion. Therefore, I'm just going to resort to overlaying my voiceover on top of footage of me playing multiplayer on the Master Chief Collection, with the occasional production still or two. Needless to say, after over 2 decades of playing multiplayer as a kid, then falling in love with the overall story as a teenager, and then forming lifelong friendships with other dudes at LAN parties as we played custom games well into the night, I'm a huge fan of this franchise. It's an excellent universe with rich lore that rivals that of other multimedia sci-fi franchises. There are novels, radio dramas, micro-series, and even a compilation of anime shorts that do a pretty good job at expanding the world, proving that Halo has some legs outside of being games where you just shoot up a bunch of aliens. If Halo had any chance of breaking through to the general non-gamer populace though, it was through film and/or television. Its potential certainly was there, given that the great Steven Spielberg himself partnered up with 343 Industries to develop a live-action series.
I've been playing games for decades. And I even started playing Pong in 1974. And over the years, that experience has exploded from the simple pixels of Pong to worlds that are as immersive as, and certainly more physically interactive, than those portrayed on the silver screen. And those stories have gotten more compelling as the technology has certainly improved. And so for me, the Halo universe is an amazing opportunity to be at that intersection where technology and myth-making meet to produce something really groundbreaking. And I'm incredibly excited about the great journey we're all on, the heroes, worlds, and wonders that Halo will take us on. Thank you.
Almost 9 years passed between the date in which the series was announced at E3 2013 and once it finally premiered on March 24th, 2022. You would think that after all that time, the producers would have had a killer set of scripts for the episodes that would consist of the first season. While general consumers of TV don't seem to mind the show all that much, the reaction from fans of the games has been largely negative. Has some of the backlash been a bit hyperbolic? Yeah, absolutely. The Halo series is far from the worst thing I've ever seen. It actually is deserving of praise in a number of aspects. One of the biggest of these is that it appropriately recreates the aesthetic of the games quite well, for the most part. Much of the iconography, such as the weapons, vehicles, alien species, and just the very production design as a whole, are quite reminiscent of the source material. If nothing else, at least from a visual standpoint, the show bears sufficient similarity to its video game counterparts. Furthermore, when action scenes start, as scarce as they may be, there's a modicum of surface-level, brainless fun you can have from seeing the explosions and gunfire flash across the screen. It's a chaotic exercise, sure, but there's enjoyment to be had. And on another note, I harbor no ill will against those who made this series, most especially the actors. Regardless if one person delivered a quality performance and the next didn't, they were just professionals hired to perform the material they were given. And with that, I do think some of the performances are enjoyable, these actors in particular particular were among my favorite players in the ensemble. It helps that their characters are better written than others, but the performance work can't be ignored. Despite all of that, the combination of all these different elements didn't mix well, to put things lightly. Where the show fundamentally missed the mark is just knowing, or really not knowing, what aspects of the universe to focus on. At its core, Halo is a very simple story, at least as far as the original game goes. I mean, humans versus aliens? You can't get more basic of a concept for sci-fi than that. But I should say that the original game did have some other elements going for it, such as the body horror manifested through the breakout of a flood infestation. The backstory of the game presented through the manual, as well as Eric Nyland's novel The Fall of Reach, go into greater details about the controversial origins of Master Chief and the other Spartan 2 super soldiers, among other things. The thing is, though, that the games gradually wove in more complex concepts and themes as the story went on. Those ideas and the lore would later be expanded by all of that mixed media material I mentioned earlier. Bungie started out simple and then eventually built out their universe. By the time that they did, their audience was already invested in the core story, and the extra stuff enriched what was already known and understood. Season 1 of the Halo series, however, threw too much out at once. I am not a screenwriter, and I never will be, so I don't want to pretend like I know better than paid individuals who are professionals at their craft. I also recognize that the games are primarily strings of back-to-back action scenes instead of constant narrative like a film or TV show. The showrunners obviously knew they couldn't just create a one-to-one adaptation of the games and expect that people would enjoy it. All of that violence would numb the brain after a while, so creative license was inevitable for crafting a story. But I'm inclined to believe that just like the original game, this show would have benefited much greater from taking a similar, simplistic approach. The key conflict of the entire Halo universe, at least in the main timeline of the series, is that humanity is losing an intergalactic war with a militarized religious cult of various alien races known as the Covenant. Every other storyline splinters off that central plot. The pilot episode of this show should have focused entirely on what's at stake in that conflict. In some ways it does, for a very brutal fight breaks out between a colony of humans, Spartan 2s, and a garrison of Covenant troops in the very beginning of the episode. We also learn that there's some kind of artifact on this same planet that the Covenant desperately wants for their crusade against the humans. The show quickly started to lose me though, once I realized how much the story was trying to pack in at once. With the introduction of elements such as the political interplay of the military, Dr. Catherine Halsey's controversial experiments with the Spartans and flash cloning, insurrectionists fighting against the UNSC, and Master Chief removing his helmet above all, it works way too hard to catch the audience's attention. I'd been a lifelong Halo fan, like I said, but even as someone who understood the expanded universe elements the writers implemented into the story, the inclusion of these elements rang completely hollow for me. It's not just for the fact that aspects of those things were changed from the games. That certainly bothered me as a fan of the games, but there's an even bigger problem that other fans seem to be overlooking in their reviews of the show. What I'm getting at is that the showrunners, who have been publicly derided for their ignorance of the original source material, did not put enough faith in the core material to believe it could stand on its own 2 feet. For all that the showrunners have said in interviews about wanting to broaden the audience for Halo, they seem to have forgotten that the Halo games had a very broad audience to begin with. That broad audience just happened to be gamers, not people who consume TV. But that market segment could easily be sucked in if they just want to stick with the established material and fluffed it up a bit to make it work on television. Instead, what we got is a story that messily throws together a bunch of different unrelated subplots into a dubious casserole. It doesn't work, and that's because the storylines simultaneously don't feel like they belong in the same universe half the time, especially the almost pointless filler that takes place on the planet Madrigal, and they also distract from the core conflict. What the showrunners should have focused on first is establishing what was at stake in humanity's fight against the Covenant, why the Covenant are even fighting humans in the first place, and why discovering Halo matters so much. Those things are only touched upon at a surface level because the show otherwise focuses so much of its attention on elements that one would consider to be window dressing in the games. And I don't know why, for this approach utterly takes away from the audience getting invested into the core story, or at least what I thought was the core story. If you asked the average viewer of this series who was unfamiliar with the source material what the main conflict was, what kind of answer would you expect them to give? Master Chief coming to terms with feeling emotions and getting a sex drive? Is the show about the oppressed rising up against their oppressors? Is it about exposing the corruption in a completely militarized, unitary government? I don't think I could confidently say that this show is about any of those things to a definitive degree. These 9 episodes come across as so cowardly in committing to its source material that it just feels like a generic sci-fi drama that just so happens to bear the iconography and jargon of the Halo franchise. And in saying that, I don't mean that the series has to stay 100% true to the games. I've already said in this video, and in my aforementioned video about video game adaptations, that the people behind these productions shouldn't feel obligated to create exact replicas of the games in a different form. Creative liberties have to be taken in some places to make a story work in a form alternate to the original. But the spirit of that same story should be intact. Or even better yet, keep the same story altogether, and then add whatever you feel would benefit your long-form adaptation. The pace at which one learns information about the world is also important. Imagine if things panned out this way for the Halo series. The first scene is John meeting Dr. Halsey and Captain Keyes at a very young age, but then we cut away before learning that he was abducted and indoctrinated by the UNSC. We immediately fast forward to him as a super soldier, and then the first season is all about the fall of Reach. This already fixes 2 problems of the series as it stands, in that the Human Covenant War feels oddly disconnected from the main events of the story, and all too quickly ruining any potential nuance or mystery about John's character. The fall of Reach is such a pivotal moment in the games because it's when humanity is at its absolute lowest point. Knowing that makes its utter devastation all the more impactful since hundreds of millions of people perish on Reach. But on the other hand, it's also when hope is rekindled for humanity with the creation of Cortana, the discovery of Forerunner artifacts, and the Pillar of Autumn's escape, giving mankind a chance to stand against the Covenant. This would have been an awesome place to start the series at, because it would have given the audience a chance to understand truly what's at stake in this horrific war, and why there's greater importance to humans winning the war than just the survival of our species. Besides, this pivotal part of the story essentially covers much of the same ground the show does, with the discovery of Forerunner technology on Reach, leading Cortana to navigate the Pillar of Autumn to Installation 04 in the original game. The showrunners also wouldn't have lost out on the opportunity to explore elements that were introduced in the show we ultimately got, considering that the origin of the Spartans and their humanity factor greatly into the story of Reach's destruction. Pacing things this way would have allowed the show to connect with fans and newcomers alike, and if they saved some of the other subplots for later seasons, at least the viewers would have already been invested in the main conflict, and their established preconceptions of the lore would have been successfully challenged later on. That being said, one can only dream up an alternative. What we got simply pales in comparison to the experience one would get from just playing the games. But it sucks admitting that, because I would have loved for the show to be great. That way, I could have had a chance to share the franchise that I love with those who haven't tasted of its goodness. Frankly though, the show just doesn't replicate the same epic scope and grandeur of the games that inspired it. When you do a poor job at establishing what this universe is all about, tell a bunch of different unrelated stories that mix together about as well as peanut butter and mayonnaise, and swap out some of the greatest musical compositions in video game history with the most basic, stock-sounding sci-fi score imaginable, you know you've messed up hard. I would have gone into more specific plot details that annoyed me, but other YouTubers have already explored those things at length. My point is that if the showrunners really wanted to make a worthy substitute for the games, they should have committed to the bit. But this show in no way acts as a suitable substitute for the games, and that's the crux of why Paramount's Halo didn't just disappoint me, it downright makes me sad. And that's it! Thank you so much for listening to me ramble about this unfortunately mediocre show for a little bit. This won't be the last time I talk about Halo though, because I want to finish that series of Halo game reviews that I simply gave up on last year. I can't guarantee that the process of finishing those videos will be quick, but I will finish them. Nonetheless, if you liked what you saw and would be eager to see more of what I have to offer, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining the notification squadron so that you don't miss out on my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great one.